The wind was the only thing that spoke out here. For 10 years, it had been Elias's only steady companion, a ceaseless whisper across the high plains that scoured the land and the man with equal indifference. It peeled paint from his barn, worried the loose shingles on his roof, and carved new lines into his face to match the old ones time and grief had already etched there. He lived in the language of silence, a tongue he had mastered after the world of men had taken everything from him worth saying. His days were a ritual of hard labor and quiet endurance, a penance paid to ghosts only he could see. Mending fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness. Tending to a handful of cattle whose weary eyes mirrored his own. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a pale river on sun-bronzed skin, would throb when the north wind blew, a physical memory of the day the words had stopped. Inside his small, Spartan cabin, a second chair sat at the dinner table, forever empty, a monument to a life that was. He'd move it to sweep, his hand gentle on the worn wood, then place it back in its exact spot. It was a promise. A hollow one, he knew, but it was all he had left. He did not ask for peace. He had settled for absence. An absence of noise, of people, of feeling. The land was unforgiving, but it was honest. It did not pretend to offer comfort. It demanded respect and strength, and in return, it offered a vast, profound solitude that wrapped around him like a shroud. He had buried his past here, deep in the unyielding dirt, and believed it would stay buried. He was wrong. The silence was a fragile thing. The sound that broke it was an obscenity. It was not the crack of lightning or the rumble of a rock slide down the mesa. It was the shriek of tortured metal, a long, tearing scream that violated the sacred quiet of the afternoon. Elias froze, his hand on a rusted strand of barbed wire. His cattle lifted their heads, their chewing stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause, listening. He straightened up, his eye scanning the horizon, drawn to the winding ribbon of asphalt that cut through his property miles to the east. A plume of black smoke, thick and oily, curled into the cobalt sky like a foul serpent. He stood motionless for a full minute, the old instinct warring with the new peace. This was not his business. The world of men and their machines was a contagion he had quarantined himself from. But the smoke was a wound in the sky, a signal of violence that pulled at something deep inside him, the part of him he thought he'd killed. He left the wire, his tools falling to the dust. His long strides back to the cabin were deliberate, his face a mask of stone. He did not grab his rifle. Not yet. He took the keys to his old truck, the engine complaining as it turned over, another reluctant creature breaking its silence. The drive was a slow pilgrimage toward the disaster. He found it in a dry wash, a large transport truck overturned and mangled, its silver trailer split open like a husk. The ground was littered with bodies, small and still, scattered among the sagebrush. He knew then this was no simple accident. As he stepped from his truck, the smell of diesel and death hit him. He moved through the wreckage, his stoicism a shield against the horror. He was about to turn away, to retreat back to his ordered world, when he heard it. A faint gasp. A fragile flutter of life in the charnel house. There, pinned beneath a piece of twisted fuselage, was a girl. Her face was bruised and streaked with blood, her black hair matted with dust, but her eyes were open. They were wells of terror and pain, but they were alive. He worked the metal free, his muscles straining. She was light, impossibly so. As he lifted her into his arms, her body convulsed, a final, desperate gasp for life shuddering through her small frame. He held her against his chest, the warmth of her a shocking intrusion, and started the long walk back to his truck. The silence he had cultivated for a decade was shattered, not by the crash, but by the weight of a dying child in his arms. He laid her on his own bed, the clean sheets a stark contrast to the grime and blood that covered her. She was a ghost child, a spectre from the violent world he had fled, now haunting the heart of his sanctuary. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that had nothing to do with ranching. The skills came back unbidden, dredged up from the depths of his buried life. He cut away the torn fabric of her clothing, his movements precise, impersonal. Her body was a roadmap of cruelty. Old scars crisscrossed her back, and a fresh brand, a stylized snake eating its tail, was seared into the flesh above her collarbone. It was a mark of ownership. He cleaned her wounds, stitched the deepest gash on her arm with a needle and thread sterilized in whiskey and flame. Her breathing was shallow, a bird's breath, but it was steady. Throughout it all, she did not cry out. She watched him. Her dark, intelligent eyes followed his every move, a flicker of fear warring with a core of hardened resilience that seemed far too old for her years. He was a stranger, a scarred giant smelling of dust and iron, yet she remained still, conserving what little strength she had. Outside, the sky broke. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled, mimicking the storm that had just crashed into his life. He finished his work, covering her with a thick wool blanket. He pulled the empty chair from the dinner table and set it by the bed, then sat down to watch over her. He was a sentry now, a guardian. The choice had been made the moment he lifted her from the wreckage. He had invited the world back in, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the world would soon come knocking. He was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was a fortress. And she was what he had to protect. The knock came 2 days later. Not a knock, but a heavy, authoritative fist pounding on his door. Elias had been watching the road. He'd seen the dust cloud from 5 miles out. 2 vehicles. A sheriff's cruiser and a black, unmarked SUV. He opened the door before the fist could fall again, filling the frame with his sighs. Sheriff Cobb stood on his porch, flanked by a young, nervous deputy. Cobb was a man who had gone soft in the middle but hard in the eyes. He wore his uniform with an air of smug ownership, as if the land and everything on it belonged to him. "Heard there was a crash out on the highway," Cobb said, his voice a folksy drawl that didn't match his predatory gaze. "Prison transport." Overturned, he was lying. Elias could smell it, a sour note beneath the man's cheap cologne. "Heard nothing," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. Cobb's smile was thin, a crack in a plaster mask. "Nothing? Big rig like that. Makes a hell of a noise." His eyes drifted past Elias, trying to pierce the shadows of the cabin. "Just the wind," Elias said. "It's all there is out here." The deputy shifted his weight, avoiding Elias's stare. He looked like a boy playing dress-up, in over his head. Cobb's gaze sharpened. "We're looking for survivors. Any you might have seen wandering around. A fugitive. Small, Asian girl." The lie was so blatant, so careless, it was an insult. "Seen no one," Elias stated flatly. He did not move. He did not blink. He was a mountain, immovable. Cobb held his stare for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought on the weathered porch. Then, the smile returned. "All right then. Just checking on my citizens." He turned to leave, then paused. "Funny thing about this wind, though," he said, his voice dropping. "It carries things. And it blows things away. You make sure you don't get blown away." It was not advice. It was a promise. As the cruiser pulled away, kicking up a rooster tail of dust, Elias knew this was just the beginning. They knew. And they would be back. After the dust from the sheriff's cruiser settled, a new kind of silence fell over the ranch. It was not the peaceful absence of before, but a taut, charged stillness, heavy with unspoken threat. Elias went to the old footlocker at the base of his bed. The lock was rusted, but the hinges opened with a well-oiled whisper. He lifted the lid. The chest did not hold memories of his lost family, it held the tools of his former life. He lifted out a long rifle, its walnut stock smooth and dark, its steel barrel gleaming with a faint sheen of gun oil. Below it lay a Colt .45, heavy and cold in his palm. He laid the weapons on the kitchen table, along with several boxes of ammunition. The metallic scent filled the small room, displacing the familiar smell of wood smoke and coffee. He began to clean them, his movements economical and sure, a ritual he had not performed in a decade but had never forgotten. The girl, Mai, had gotten out of bed. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in his blanket, watching him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She did not ask what he was doing. She did not need to. She walked to the table, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She looked at the guns, then at him. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a shared understanding. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on a spare piece of pine board, she drew. Her hand was steady. She drew a circle, a snake with its tail caught in its mouth. The brand from her collarbone. The symbol of her captors. She tapped the drawing with her finger, then pointed toward the road where Cobb had disappeared. It was a warning. A confirmation. A silent declaration of war. He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from her drawing to the rifle in his hands. The past was no longer buried. It was here, on his table, waiting to be used. He was a rancher no more. He was what Cobb and his men had made him. And he would be ready for them. The waiting was a physical presence. It sat with him on the porch as the sun bled out across the western plains, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. The wind had died down, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the scrub brush, was magnified in the expectant quiet. Elias sat in his rocking chair, the rifle resting across his lap, its cold weight a familiar comfort. He was not the same man who had sat here yesterday. The shell of the solitary rancher had cracked, and the man he had tried to bury was looking out from behind his eyes. He thought of the life he had built here, a fortress of solitude meant to keep the world out. He saw now it was never a fortress, only a cage. He had run from the violence of men, from the grief of a world that takes without reason, only to find it had followed him here, delivered to his doorstep in the form of a broken girl. The fight was no longer a choice. It was a debt. A debt to the living, to the small girl sleeping inside who had looked at him not as a monster or a savior, but as an ally. The moon rose, a stark white disk in an ocean of stars, spilling silver light over the parched earth. Inside, a floorboard creaked. Mai appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the faint lamplight. She held out a tin cup of water. He took it without a word, their fingers brushing. It was a simple gesture, but it sealed the pact between them. The scarred recluse and the resilient survivor. Two silent figures on a lonely precipice, waiting for the darkness to come for them. He drank the water, its coolness a small grace in the coming storm. He set the cup down and his hand returned to the rifle. The moon climbed higher. The wait continued. The first sign was a flicker of light on the far horizon, a false dawn in the east. Then another, and another. Headlights. Not one set, but three, moving fast, eating up the dirt road that led to his ranch. They came without stealth, an arrogant procession of predators certain of their prey. Elias didn't move from his chair. He watched them come, his thumb resting on the rifle's safety. The time for waiting was over. The time for consequences had arrived. The trucks fanned out as they approached, their high beams cutting through the darkness, pinning the small cabin in a web of blinding light. Doors slammed, men shouted. They were loud, confident. They thought he was just a farmer. He let them get closer, let them spread out, their dark shapes moving against the glare. Then he pushed the safety off. The click was imperceptible to them, but to him, it was a thunderclap. He didn't fire from the porch. That's what they expected. He slipped out the back, a ghost in the shadows he knew better than his own skin. The first shot was from the darkness near the barn. A spotlight shattered, plunging one flank into confusion. The second shot, from a different position near the water trough, took out the engine block of the lead truck. Panic began to fray their arrogance. They were firing blind now, spraying bullets into the night, their muzzle flashes giving him new targets. He moved between the sparse cover of his own property, a wraith armed with a decade of repressed fury. One shot, one man. He was not defending his home. He was hunting on his own land. The sounds of the fight were sharp and brutal, the crack of his rifle, the angry retort of their automatic weapons, the cry of a man hit. He moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its clarity. This was not a battle for survival. It was an act of purification. And he was the flame. The fight funneled inward, a tightening spiral of violence with the cabin at its center. 2 men down, 1 truck disabled. The others, smarter now, more desperate, pushed toward the house. They knew the girl was inside. Elias fell back, melting into the deeper shadows of the barn, reloading as he went. He heard the crash of his front door being kicked in. Cobb's voice, bellowing orders. He had to end it. Now. He circled around, entering the barn through a rear hatch he'd used for hay. The air was thick with the smell of animals and gunpowder. He climbed the ladder to the loft, the rifle left behind, the heavy Colt .45 now in his hand. Through the slats, he saw Cobb dragging Mai from the house, her small form struggling against his bulk. "We've got what we came for," Cobb shouted to his remaining man. "Torch it. Leave nothing." A flicker of orange light bloomed from the cabin window. Fire. Elias dropped from the loft, landing silently in the hay below. The last goon was splashing gasoline on the porch when Elias's hand closed around his throat. It was over in a second. A sharp, brutal economy of motion. Then there was only Cobb. The sheriff saw him then, a dark shape emerging from the barn, silhouetted against the growing flames of his burning home. He shoved Mai to the ground and drew his weapon. "You should have stayed out of it, old man." Cobb snarled, his face lit by the fire, a mask of crazed fury. Elias didn't answer. He walked forward, his own gun held low. It wasn't about the gun. It was about closing the distance. Cobb fired, the shot going wide. Elias lunged, tackling him to the ground. The world became a maelstrom of dust and firelight. It was primal, ugly. Fists and grunts and the desperate fight for dominance. Cobb was strong, fueled by rage, but Elias was fueled by something colder, harder. A right hook caught Elias on his scar, and for a second, the world exploded in white-hot pain. As he staggered, Cobb scrambled for his dropped pistol. But Mai was there. She brought a heavy piece of firewood down on Cobb's hand with all her might. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Cobb screamed, and in that moment, it was over. Elias was on him, the fire reflecting in his eyes. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hungry crackle of the flames devouring his home. As dawn broke, it revealed a scene of quiet devastation. The cabin was a smoldering skeleton, black timbers reaching like charred fingers toward a pale, indifferent sky. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of spent cordite. Elias stood before the ruins, his face a mask of soot and exhaustion. A fresh cut wet blood along his old scar. He was looking at the ashes of his 10-year penance, but he felt no loss. Only a grim, hollow finality. The war was over. Mai stood beside him, a small, still figure wrapped in his singed wool blanket. She looked at the wreckage, then up at him. Her eyes were not those of a victim. They were the eyes of a survivor, a partner in the night's terrible work. In the distance, a new dust cloud rose. A single vehicle, moving steadily toward them. It was not the law of Cobb's kind. It was an old contact, a ghost from Elias's past, summoned by a pre-dawn call on a satellite phone he kept for emergencies he never thought he'd have. A path to safety for the girl. A way out. The car, a nondescript sedan, pulled up. A quiet woman in plain clothes got out, her gaze taking in the scene without comment. She opened the back door for Mai. It was time. Elias knelt down, so his eyes were level with the girl's. Words were useless things between them. They had spoken a more profound language in the crucible of violence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird he'd whittled during the long nights of waiting. He pressed it into her hand. Her small fingers closed around it. For the first time, a fragile emotion breached her stoic reserve. Her eyes glistened. She gave a single, sharp nod. A gesture of immense gratitude and shared history. Then she turned and got into the car without looking back. Elias stood and watched as the sedan drove away, carrying the last echo of the storm with it. He watched until it was just a dust speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. He was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was not an absence. It was a choice. It was clean. This is a story of a quiet man and a silent girl. It is a story of how a decade of isolation, a wall built to keep out the pain of the world, can be torn down by a single, desperate gasp for life. It is a story about the violence that hides in plain sight, carried in the trucks that pass us on the highway, and overseen by the men who wear badges and swear oaths. It shows that evil is not always a distant monster. Sometimes it is the corrupt authority that smiles in your face, confident in your silence. But this is also a story about the profound power of a single choice. The choice to stop, to look, to act. The choice to shelter the weak, to stand against the strong, and to reclaim a humanity you thought was lost forever. One man, armed with a buried past and a reluctant conscience, can become a bulwark against the tide. One child, stripped of everything but her will to survive, can become the catalyst for justice. Her resilience was not a request for pity, but a demand for action. His violence was not for revenge, but for redemption. They prove that in the face of systemic cruelty, the most potent weapon is not a rifle, but the unbreakable courage of an ordinary person who refuses to look away. The world is full of broken places and silent victims. Their stories are not always written in plumes of smoke against the sky. More often, they are whispered in the shadows, their pain hidden behind the mundane facade of everyday life. The choice to intervene is a heavy one, and the silence of inaction is a comfortable shroud. But a life lived in a fortress of one's own making is a life lived in a cage. Do not wait for the sound of screaming metal to awaken your conscience. Do not wait for the fire to be at your own door. Listen for the quiet gasps in the darkness. See the resilience in the eyes of the suffering. Find your voice in the silence. Be the one who stands.